Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. At exactly this time of year, about 22 years ago, I arrived in a country torn apart by war. My first assignment was to analyse the systemic geopolitical environment and the interconnection with the socio-political, cultural, and economic situation at local level, and then to develop and deliver interventions on two levels: to address underlying long-term conflict issues and to facilitate resolution of acute disputes arising on a short-term basis. Access to justice was a challenge locally, regionally, globally. Local courts were not functioning and other third-party neutral processes were unavailable or unknown by commercial parties in that context. That was then, and that was a very different time. Now 22 years on, ADR is a globally recognised set of dispute resolution processes. Mediation, arbitration, and adjudication are used locally around the world and globally. The global business and legal community attitudes have changed profoundly. Welcome to the series Acute Dispute and Underlying Conflict, co-hosted by JAMS and the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. My name is Isabel Phillips. I'm Director of ADR and Mediation Development at the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. The practice has straddled the commercial and political contexts from conflict specialists and mediator in both commercial and fragile and post-conflict environments. I'm co-moderator for this webinar together with Ranse Howell from JAMS. Please note that this seminar is being recorded and will be available on YouTube about 2 weeks after this event. The webinar will be 1 hour long. We'll have this short introduction for an introduction by Ranse, thoughts from our 3 speakers, followed by discussion and Q&A. Please do add questions in the question and answer tool at any point and use the chat function for general discussion and any technical problems that you might be experiencing. This is the second webinar of the Acute Dispute series. The title is Civil Commercial Neutrals and the Fallout of Conflict in the Civil Commercial Context. And it's happening in the context of the first full-scale interstate war in Europe since World War II. Now, I have an awareness that sadly many of you calling in from around the world will have experience of some or all of these issues arising out of armed conflict from other contexts. This series looks at the disputes levels, disputes arising out of that context, not ignoring but differentiating issues of underlying conflict, requiring fundamental and transformational constructive conflict engagement from what we as conflict resolution professionals might be able to offer in dispute contexts. And this is something that's important in relation to many of the profound challenges of our time: climate crisis, sustainable development, the public health crisis highlighted by COVID, and other pressing issues around things such as diversity and inclusion. So today we're going to hear from 3 arbitrators and mediators, so neutrals as they're called in some contexts, whose practice has already been directly affected by conflict. And as once again to reiterate, this is about the focus of the fallout of conflict for civil commercial disputes, not around the politics of the current situation. So let me briefly introduce our wonderful speakers for this webinar. Olena Perepelynsk is the partner and head of arbitration at Integrities in Kiev. She's president of the Ukrainian Arbitration Association and fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. She's acted as counsel, arbitrator, and expert in over 150 arbitrations under a variety of arbitration rules. And her practice is focused on agriculture, energy, and transportation industries. Karolina Jackowicz is a lawyer by background and a two-hatted professional, as she describes herself. She's an experienced mediator and a creative and tech industry professional who's trying to infuse tech island innovation into dispute resolution using the mediator toolbox in handling tech projects. Her ADR practice and communication consultancy primarily delivers online and caters to the needs of digital natives and busy professionals. Last but not least, Tim Hardy is a full-time international arbitrator and mediator. He's regularly appointed in all manner of complex commercial disputes and might be described as the grandfather of FCIArb's arbitration practice guidelines. He rewrote the arbitration guidelines and arbitration and mediation rules while serving on the FCIArb Practice and Standards Committee between 2011 and 2017. Finally, I'd like to briefly introduce my co-moderator, Ranse Howell. Ranse Howell is the Director of International Operations at JAMS ADR. He's an expert in negotiation and consultancy, and in his previous work with CEDA, his clients included the EIB, EBRD, and UNHCR. He holds a PhD, a JD, and is an adjunct professor at both Pepperdine and Westminster. And now I'd like to hand over to Ranse to take it from here.
Thank you very much, Isabel, and I really do appreciate the opportunity to participate in this dialogue that we're having. And also, thank you so much for participating, because I know that you're currently you're dealing with your own fallout from COVID, and yet as a trooper, you still managed to pull through. So thank you very much. JAMS is very pleased and excited to partner with the Chartered Institute in really having a conversation and dialogue about some of the triggers and some of the emerging issues that we'll be currently facing. What I'd like to do is really put some context in this and give a very quick recap for what we introduced last session. And using that framework, the participants from the previous session also were able to provide us with a very useful, I'm just sharing my screen and I just realized I can't do two things at the same time. Goodness me. There we go. So, and what we're going to do is provide a frame, and that framework can be applied in this context and in any context. And it's really useful for us to have something that is quick, easily and identifiable, so that you can work with your clients, your teams, or also you can work with your own conflicts that you're going through. So the reason why we're talking about this is that often when disputes emerge, we think to ourselves, well, we haven't seen this sort of thing before. Where do we go? Do we go, left or right, or do we just? Are you one of those people that just say, well, I'll put my head down and just hope it will work out? A bit like if we were approaching a maze, you go, you're approaching the maze, should I go right or left? And that, well, I've got a 50% chance of being right and a 50% chance of being wrong. However, wouldn't it be wonderful if we're able to actually kind of have almost a helicopter guide view and sort of see and survey what the maze looks like? It's still a bit of a challenge, but you've got some idea about where you're starting and where you need to end up. And ultimately, that's what we're trying to provide you with. A lot of what we're seeing are sort of some of the same things that were discussed 2 years ago. I remember in February of 2020, I was reading some fascinating sort of stats from, and this is a clip from The Economist, about some of the supply chain challenges that would emerge for what they thought would be a fairly brief or short interruption, but as we know, it was much, much longer. And really thinking about, well, you don't necessarily have to wait until the goods haven't arrived at the dock. What can you do to prevent or be proactive? And then what JAMS did is we pulled together a working group, and we actually started to produce some information and guidelines based on the neutral's experience and professionals' experience about how they've seen disputes resolve, and also what the triggers are and the mechanisms that need to be introduced. And so one of the other things that was interesting is also what are people thinking about the priorities and what are they considering to be important? And at the beginning of this year, Baker McKenzie produced a very useful guide. And one of the questions that they asked the participants, which is which of the following external factors poses the greatest potential threat to your organization in terms of increasing exposure to disputes? And you see at the top, as you'd imagine, it's COVID. And way down at the bottom, I think 11% people said geopolitical issues. Where we asked the same question 3 months later, or in March of this year at the USC JAMS Symposium in California, and it was a very different response. Still, COVID was high, But the thing that was highest and the thing that got people thinking most, and of course, potentially the greatest threat, was the geopolitical issues. And you could just see how things shift and how attention gets drawn. COVID is still out there. And so we still need to be aware of the triggers and the impact, but we also want to be nimble enough to recognize the things that will cause the greatest impact straight away. We introduced something which was a very simple approach, which was sort of providing a macro view, and you can use this and apply it. And so you want to think about what is happening. What are the identifying, what's the event? What are the triggers that are causing this disruption, the dispute, or this conflict? And of course, the word conflict has many different terms and many different meanings, but what we're meaning really, what is going to cause this commercial difficulty? Then you've got to think about, where is it? Is it somewhere local? Is it national, or is it international? And often people think, well, if it's happening over there, it's not going to have an impact on me. We know that's not necessarily true, because with the chip shortage, or the semiconductor shortage and the concern, we understand that one component can shut down a whole factory, and even that component is maybe like 5,000 miles away. Who are the parties? Who are the potential disputants? Who are the stakeholders that need to be involved? It's not necessarily just the direct individuals that need to be discussed. Why would you want to deal with this, and to ignore what would mean what? And you've got to think about a short, medium, and long-term intervention. Sheila Bates from Fusion HR again used the same process and identified the what, the where, the who, the why, and the when. And again, kind of taking it through, provided and talked through a really useful approach from her perspective. And that recording is available, and Isabel will be providing guidelines or providing direction to that at the end of the session. And Michael Makaroff also provided the same approach from his perspective, thinking about the energy issues and how quickly people could respond to alternative sources of fuel or gas, and what companies and organizations and jurisdictions might be considering. So again, using the same approach. So it is something that can be applied. And so what we're trying to think about here is really, so we provided a framework. Now, what should we do? My suggestion is we should listen, and that's the reason why we have the speakers today and the ones in the next two sessions. Listen to what they're saying in their experience, acknowledge what they're saying and what they're meaning, and how does it relate to you, and learn from that. And then you can respond, rather than just sort of responding with your own ideas and your interaction, because everything is quite unique to a particular situation and circumstance. So this is giving you a brief framework, bit of an introduction, bit of an idea about why we're discussing this, and I really look forward to the conversation continuing. Isabel.
Thank you, Ranse, and apologies to everybody. I shall try and speak a little louder. I just gathered that you were struggling to hear me. So I'd like to hand over now to Olena as our first speaker. Olena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isabel, for introduction, and for thank you for organizers for this opportunity to discuss the problems in contract disruption related to the war in Ukraine. Of course, for obvious reasons, many contracts related to Ukraine or involving Ukrainian parties have been disrupted by the war. However, today I would like to focus on some major problems of agricultural and related sectors. Why? Because of the significance of this for Ukrainian economy and for the world in general, as Ukraine is one of the world's biggest exporters of corn, wheat, and sunflower oil. And traditionally, about 70% of these goods have been exported via Black Sea and Azov Sea ports of Ukraine. Now Russia effectively blocked all Ukrainian ports and is trying to cut Ukraine's access to the sea, to both seas generally. In addition, Russia has destroyed or simply stolen over hundreds of thousands of tons of Ukrainian agricultural products in the occupied territories. This poses several problems and affects different types of contracts entered into before the war and to be entered now after the beginning of the Russian aggression. And I think the major group of such contracts would be sale of goods contracts, transportation contracts, and insurance. So starting from transportation, the ongoing war has considerable impact on vessel calling ports in the Black Sea and the Azov Sea. Ukraine has closed all its ports for operation. Some of the ports are now occupied by Russia. In addition, there is a security risk in the area because there are some mined areas and drifting mines. And in addition, some Ukrainian and non-Ukrainian commercial vessels have been either sighted or shelled by the Russian Navy. Turning to insurance, as a result of the war in Ukraine, all ports in Russia and certain sea areas in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov have been included in the list of whole war piracy, terrorism, and related perils listed areas by the Joint War Committee, and actually all the owners are advised to get in touch with their war risk insurers to check the situation as applicable to this region. And turning back to the sale of goods, because this is actually major trading operation. So we have problems with export of Ukrainian commodities. And these problems are not only Ukrainian problems because of the current situation. If Ukrainian agricultural products are, for whatever reasons, are not exported as they normally are, this might cause a food security risk for different parts of the world. In addition to the export problems, Ukraine also had some import problems because some commodities that should have been delivered to Ukraine, for instance, coal, via Ukrainian seaports, could not simply reach their destination. And Ukrainian companies cannot receive the goods they have paid for, their sellers cannot deliver the goods as they should, and the vessels owners again are simply waiting for instructions, and this all simply increase the transportation costs. So these problems have already had an impact on the contracts concluded before the war. And they, of course, have impact on the new contracts. And what kind of issues are or kind of solutions are considered? Alternative logistics, this is obvious. What is happening now? Now Ukraine is trying to change its logistic using its railways in order to reach some alternative ports either in the Black Sea or in some other areas, or simply deliver the goods on some other basis. But of course, Ukrainian transport system was not designed to transport such huge amounts of commodities in different directions, because normally it was all done to the Black Sea and Sea of Azov ports of Ukraine, not the way vice versa. This, of course, makes the entire logistic very expensive and efficient and slow. And in addition, Ukrainian railways have different broad rail wheels of the wagons. In comparison was European standards are, because we have our Soviet era standards still. And that is why they need to change that when passing the border. And in addition, what other kind of solutions? Of course, settlement talks, trying to find a commercial feasible solution and acceptable for different stakeholders. And this might include different options if the goods have not reached Ukraine. In case of the import, again, the parties could consider selling them to some third-party buyers or selling them back to the original seller. And they taken into account the fast changing prices of the commodities in the market, because the war in Ukraine has a huge impact on the prices on the market. It could be wash out, it could be in some situation, it could be simply restructuring of payment or some amendment of some other obligations depending on the situation. So the list could be quite long, and if the parties are really willing to find a acceptable solution, they could do it using different IDR techniques. Thank you.
Thank you, Olena. That was really fascinating. There's and it highlights a whole range of issues around contract issues around the commodities market. And I think many of those are issues that will be very familiar to people in other regions of the world who've experienced such issues. So I think there's some really interesting learning to be had there. I'd now like to pass to Karolina Jackowicz, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isabel. So good afternoon, everyone. Let me just try to first get my screen so that you can see my presentation. Can you see my screen now? I think you should be able to. Okay, cool. Right, so hello everyone. As Isabel had mentioned, I am a neutral, but most of all, I share the two hats of a mediator as well as a creative industries professional. I work in the tech field, and I am also a creative professional, meaning that I design things. And actually today, what I wanted to share with you is something a little bit different than what Olena had shared, and it's less lawyerly and much more kind of business/social skills and the experiences that we've been through. And those are the experiences that directly stem from the fallout of the conflict, of the war in Ukraine, and leading a team of international professionals where we have a project that involves participants and delivers a product that will be available across many countries that happen to be on the different sides of the conflict. So I am involved in a commercial project where we have people from both Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, as well as some other European countries. And we have had a school of life when it comes to dealing with the situation, actually staying a team as a team through the fallout. And this is what I wanted to share with you. And those are some big questions and some new challenges to us. And by that, I would like to refer to what Ranse had mentioned in the beginning, that the current crisis seems to an extent similar a challenge to the COVID crisis. And actually, for us as a team, it felt totally different because COVID seemed to be the same experience for everyone. We shared this loneliness, the sudden being cut off from going to work and doing everything suddenly online. And we felt like everyone had the same experience. And right now we feel exactly the opposite, because not everyone has the same experience being placed in different regions of the world with different communication, with different perceptions, with different experiences, and even geographically not feeling the proximity to the same extent, and therefore not considering the war as a big threat or as a smaller threat. Everyone has a different experience. So the big questions that we had to quickly go through in this school of life situation where the war had broke out. So that's a question. The first that you see on the screen is about being neutral. And that's my question to you. I will be very curious to hear what you have, what are your experiences, and how would you answer this question when it comes to us as the third-party neutrals? Are we ever really neutral? And the second question is, can we or should we stay neutral? That's if we answer yes to the first question of whether we are neutral. And personally, I think that it's not entirely possible to stay neutral. And even in the field of mediation or dispute resolution as a whole, it's a bit of a myth that we are those neutrals, because we are all shaped by our experiences, by our views. We have our biases, whether conscious or unconscious. And I think that it's just impossible to stay neutral. And even sometimes, as the second question goes, maybe it's not always the best option. And here I would like to present a quote from Desmond Tutu, that sometimes remaining neutral in the situation of injustice is supporting being on the side of the aggressor or the oppressor. So I'll be curious to hear whether you share that view or not. And ultimately, this is the view that we came to share as a team of those international professionals, that we had to speak up and call things what they are. However, in answer to the third question of what to expect from others, we got to the conclusion that we cannot expect the same from everyone involved, especially when we are talking about some professionals that we assumed wrongly, as it turned out, were in the same situation when it comes to their freedom of speech, their freedom of expression, or even the sourcing of the information, which in some situations can be very limited, and therefore maybe they cannot be expected to make free choices. Therefore, we shouldn't also expect them to denounce certain situations, because their experiences, their information sources will not allow them to do that. So that led us to another question of when to talk and how to talk so that we can keep our team as a team and deliver the project to the very end. And here I'm coming to some, practical approaches to how to talk when you have a team of people that may be coming from different backgrounds and disagreeing with each other, as we do right now in the situation of war. So first of all, we had to give each other some time and space, because at first everyone was in the state of shock. However, there were a lot of strong emotions that were talking through us, that we had in our hearts and in our heads, and they were not good for the project. So we had to give each other time and space, but we couldn't ignore the situation, because it was like this, elephant in the room that we had to address. We were confronted with the situation, like Olena had mentioned, that everything all of a sudden changed, and that our long-term planning had been impacted by the situation, and we had to reverse to taking some little steps and to more short-term planning when it comes to the goals of our project. And we had to introduce some more flexibility into running our projects to deliver the final product. So all of that was actually based on listening and going down to the human experience that we all have, because this is what's crucial and why I'm talking about it, because, we're talking about civil and commercial disputes, but ultimately, I think that, once again, please share your views. I think that all business is about people, and people are what matters the most whether it comes to us as the team, or whether it comes to people who are the buyers, the decision makers, those who decide to purchase any product or any service. So our goal was to keep the team and to well, not to ignore the elephant in the room, but to go through this fast-tracked kind of lesson in philosophy and morality, I would say, to some extent, in real life, of the situation where we have, well, the victim, and when we have the aggressor, the oppressor, and still we have to keep the team and deliver the product. So to talk about some more specific, let me just check the time. Okay, I think I have about 1 more minute to to talk about how we dealt with that and about the resources. So what we found very useful were the resources on talking with people who have very different opposing views, and that refers a lot of literature that we found well, helpful as our project managers, were the literature on how to talk across the divide and how to actually try to communicate when we feel like people well, do speak different languages. So I'm sharing with you some resources here, and I actually have some more lined up that I can share with you later when it comes to the books that help find some advice on how to talk with others. And actually, okay, so that was so to sum up, as I have 1 more minute, was that we had a situation where we have a team of people that come from Russia, Belarus, and other countries where we have very different experiences, and we cannot expect everyone to share the same, to share the same situation, to share the same view. We had to change our goals. We had to change our project timelines because we are currently in a situation of uncertainty. And what was the most helpful was this mediator actually listening toolbox, that we had to listen to each other, acknowledge that we cannot control the situation, and actually acknowledge that we cannot well, always have an impact on what's happening, but also we tried to deliver the product because it was important for everyone involved not to suddenly say that, well, because you come from that state that is the aggressor, the oppressor, we're cutting ties with you, because ultimately we have to talk. And maybe it's not always, going back to the question of when to talk, maybe it's not always to talk when the emotions run high and to be a bit more cool-headed, but at the same time, what was important for our team was to acknowledge the hard and inconvenient truths at some time. And actually, okay, Isabel, you're coming. Shall I address the question that came up here about unintentional biases, or shall we talk about it later?
Let's unmute myself first. Let's raise that shortly, because I think it does relate to a number of the other questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will. Okay, thank you.
And a really fascinating insight. Again, mediators applying mediation skills themselves in their own context. That's a fascinating insight into both the application of some of these skills and into a project running across conflict lines. So now I'd like to hand the last but not least to Tim. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Isabel. First of all, a huge respect to Olena for coming on and sharing with her experiences. We feel for you. Now, fascinating presentations, which I've both listened to very carefully. I'm very concerned by the question which Karolina asks, am I truly neutral? Something I do spend time thinking about. And we'll come to that in questions, no doubt. Okay, so I have a short presentation which I want to share with you my thoughts, particularly related to the issues which Olena referred to as being thrown up by the conflict in Ukraine. There's been reference made to the fact that there are some similarities between the experiences with contractual difficulties arising from the COVID pandemic and from the conflict. But of course, they're of a completely different order and impact in a completely different way. Nevertheless, there are parallels, and I think there's some learning from the pandemic which we can actually reflect on and use in working out how best to respond to all of the problems which are going to be thrown up by the conflict. Based here in the UK, I particularly looking back on the initiative which was started by the British Institute of International and Comparative Law in April 2020, when they published a paper raising the concept of introducing a breathing space into commercial relationships and not to immediately jump into the normal reaction to a breach of contract, a failure to supply, a delay in payment. Instead of jumping straight to a dispute, instead to step back and reflect more thoroughly on the impact, the long-term impact of such actions when the country was and the economy was under such threat from the pandemic. And I think that that there's some good principles were discussed and some good thought went into this particular issue. And the HM government came out with its own guidance on what it called responsible contractual behavior in the performance and enforcement of contracts impacted by the COVID emergency. And there was a long list of situations where parties would typically turn to the law and take some action to perhaps enforce security, to start a court action, to maybe start insolvency proceedings, repossess property. And they suggested that there was a better course, which was to not to do those things and instead to discuss alternative solutions. They didn't actually provide any guidance on alternative solutions other than referring to alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. And then a debate followed, and some of the city law firms here in London came up with more granular detail as to how you might do that. And the one piece of all of that, which I thought was most impactful, was the suggestion that we should actually be using a new form of alternative dispute resolution in these situations. We should not be using arbitration or mediation because they are too confrontational in the way that they're practiced. And instead it needed a more considered approach, which is sometimes referred to as facilitated negotiation or facilitated renegotiation of the contract. And the Chartered Institute with CEDA, the Centre for Effective Dispute Resolution in the UK, that is probably the premier provider of mediation services here and has a very big footprint internationally. They together came up with a scheme for renegotiating these types of situations through facilitation rather than a mediation. Now, some people think that that's just semantics, but actually it's a lot more than that if done properly. Because the big difference is that in a facilitation, the facilitator will take control, complete control of the process, and will drive who meets whom, when and where, all with a view to saving the relationship, not pursuing the right that one party may have against the other in law. And that's a really important and significant difference. So my suggestion is that the plethora of disputes which are already being thrown up and which are going to continue as a consequence of the conflict would be better resolved through a facilitative approach rather than through either mediation or arbitration. I practice both mediation and arbitration, so I seem to be arguing to reduce my own practice. But of course, most neutrals are very well experienced and capable of conducting the facilitation, just as they are any of the other processes. But it is helpful to study facilitation as opposed to mediation, because there is a lot of science around it. And there's one particular resource which I would draw to your attention, which I think is absolutely brilliant, and which I wish that more disputes lawyers were familiar with. And this is a book by Stephen Covey called The Third Alternative. And it's really a foundation course in how to facilitate the conversations between parties when they've got a dispute and avoid it escalating. One of the problems I see so often in the practice I have as mediator and arbitrator is that parties, as soon as a dispute arises, turn to their disputes lawyers, who by training just have a knee-jerk reaction to start some process or start arguing aggressively. Whereas if they were able to adopt a more facilitative, open approach to trying to save the relationship rather than protect their clients' rights, then I think they'd have a different outcome. So that's all I'd like to say by way of introductory remarks. And I look forward to discussing this and the other issues which have been raised by the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Really interesting highlighting there of another complementary tool in the ADR toolbox. I'd like to bring Ranse in at this point to take us into some discussion amongst the three speakers and around the structure that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and thank you very much, Isabel, and it's really fascinating, and thank you so much for the three speakers that we've had, because what you shared, we could fill an entire program, a full day. And Tim, what you just also said really strike the chord with what we've been suggesting, is having that much more proactive approach and using the skills that you have, but adapt them in that way, in a unique way. And talking about, and picking up your last point, Tim, and this is to all of you, I don't know who wants to go first. We're talking from the neutrals perspective, but also neutrals or ADR professionals can give guidance and can speak from their own experience about what sort of dispute mechanisms need to be considered as people are writing contracts which will have to anticipate the disputes of the future. What do you think needs to actually be part of that dispute resolution clause? And we used to hear that the dispute resolution clause was the Cinderella clause, and it was written sort of almost at midnight. I think it's now the star of the show, and it has so much more attention. We saw that with COVID, and now we're seeing this now. So either Tim, Olena, or Karolina, I don't know who wants to go first. What do you think should be contained in the dispute resolution clause, and what sort of flexible approach is required?
I could start, if I may.
Sure.
So probably I'm a bit biased as an arbitration practitioner, but judging from even the current situation. So for instance, Ukrainian court system is now not functioning properly for obvious reasons, while arbitration is still an available option. And even the arbitration institutions in Ukraine are operated in some limited mode, but they do render, they administer cases, they accept new cases, and technically they could administer them further. There is a question whether the parties are in the position to participate properly in the case because of the access to the documents, to evidence, and even availability of counsel, etc., etc. But generally, arbitration is an option for dispute resolution. But this does not mean that negotiations is not an option. For those conflicts or disputes which I'm aware of, because of the contract disruption during the war, the parties first have always tried to negotiate and to settle, even if this is not written in their contract. Of course, it's possible to somehow motivate them to start with the negotiations if you include that clause in dispute resolution clause, and normally it is included in one way or another. It's not necessarily like a binding option or some formal stage. It usually is perceived as such a first stage, but even if the wording is quite soft in terms of its necessity and any preclusion to go further. So I would expect to see something like that
Okay. So oh, my light has gone out. So Karolina, thank you very much, Olena. From your perspective, what do you think have we learned, and what should be in a clause?
I think that I can refer to some practical experiences and share as what Olena had just mentioned, that negotiation always happens. People try to talk and they try to avoid the lawyers. They try to talk with each other. Unfortunately, too frequently, they are at such a stage of the dispute that this talking only makes them dig themselves deeper into their and they become more confrontational. So I think, based on my experiences, that people will always talk the negotiation part. It doesn't need to be spelled out, because I think people always try to negotiate, and the steps in the clause, I think this is the most practical approach, especially that as I've been following the discussion right now of our participants, and many of them mention some solutions approach that some you don't even need to have a name for a procedure, but look more for the solutions, some practical solutions, as opposed to legal processes, and even look for some hybrid processes, or looking for the name. It's just about finding a solution, and that usually happens at the early stage and directly between the parties, if it happens.
Okay, thank you, Karolina. And Tim, I'm going to ask you the same question, but slightly adapted. So dispute resolution clauses are important. We understand what mechanisms. You've mentioned facilitation, but I think, as you potentially said, there needs to be something else. So what something else could there be, and people could anticipate to include?
Okay, thank you. I agree with Olena and Karolina that it's important to be as precise as you can, frankly, in a dispute resolution clause. I've always, when I was in practice advising on these things, recommended escalation clauses. And I think escalating through facilitation as the starting point is really, really important. And not just in this in the context of disputes from conflict, but generally, because it's a really very, very good process. And I do see mediations that come to me where the parties end up renegotiating the contract. And you think, well, but they've been going through a litigation process. Why not have they been doing this when actually there was a will there to renegotiate? I had one last week. They'd been in the events occurred in 2015. They were coming on for trial later this year, and they renegotiated their contract. That's crazy. So yes, missed opportunity, a huge expense, and distress, and a lot of business between the two that they lost. What else? It needs education. Yeah. It needs education. It needs the lawyers to be educated. It needs the businessmen to be educated. It needs the dispute resolution providers, the institutions like JAMS, like FCIArb, to promote these things more heavily.
Excellent. Well, and that's exactly what we would suggest, is that it's about spreading the word, because you could put facilitation in a contract, but if people don't actually understand what it means, it could have a completely different kind of reading, and they'll say, we don't understand that, it's not appropriate, and they'll do something completely different. Isabel, do we have, I know we have some great questions that have come in. Is there anything that you'd like to ask?
I'd just like to add a brief point at this point. The Deutsche Institut für Schiedsrichtung, so the German arbitration rules actually interestingly include a compulsion for the arbitrator to being required to actively discuss settlement opportunities. And I see, unsurprisingly, the civil lawyers in this context nodding vehemently, and I think that's quite an interesting point, because it does open up this thing about what, as neutrals, do we have a responsibility to do in terms of promoting not just negotiation in terms of contract termination, but promoting discussion around different ways of resolving the problem so that the relationship can continue. And particularly in contexts where terminating a relationship through a legal process is incredibly difficult because of the lack of court function. It has a whole different meaning, which I think many people on this call will probably identify with in terms of the questions. I think there's one or two specific questions that might be of interest to a number of people, and specifically around the contract clauses. There's one about specifically aimed at you, Olena, but I think the others might also have questions, which is around parties invoking force majeure clauses and whether such references are always actually correct. So maybe a word on that. I'm conscious of time too.
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, this is one of the most often asked questions when we are talking with Ukrainian clients and foreign clients somehow affected by the war. And there is a Ukrainian angle of this problem, and more broadly a contractual angle. So starting with Ukrainian angle and Ukrainian law, so we have a legal definition of what the force majeure is in our law on Chamber of Commerce and Industries. And we also have the letter from issued by the Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce and Industry in the first days of the war, declaring that the war could be qualified as a force majeure event because it was subjectively unavoidable and not and like meeting all the legal requirements to be the force majeure event, but of course subject to the whether it really precluded performance of the contract and whether this performance should have taken place after 24th of February. But this is like, to whom it may concern letter. This is not a certificate on force majeure aimed or to confirm the force majeure event for a particular contract. What happened that many Ukrainian parties decided to invoke or to rely on that letter in order to explain or somehow justify failure to perform their contractual obligations, even if they are located in a zone which is not largely affected by the hostilities, or even if it's simply payment obligation or like really questionable situation. So even in Ukrainian perspective, with this letter is not always a panacea, or it's not always true that the particular contract have been affected by force majeure event. Looking more broadly, and even for instance in the problems discussed before and in my presentation, so if we're talking about some international contracts and probably governed by some other law, not Ukrainian law, with probably some other definition of force majeure and not applicable Ukrainian legal definition of that force majeure. So usually the war is included into the force majeure clauses. This is one of the probably typical events, not necessarily, but most often it could be found there. But the wording of force majeure clauses could be quite different in every contract. It might or might not be applicable to a particular situation because and it might also trigger some different steps or consequences, like cancellation of the contract. But indeed, even if so, there could be some additional requirements or mechanism in order to use this opportunity. In any case, with Ukrainian ports blocked, many contracts are simply in a deadlock. I mean, if you do not negotiate any new provisions, the existing provisions of the contract may not be saved by simply declaring or relying on force majeure, because, okay, let's, even if it's possible to invoke it, and what then? So 2 months waiting with the cargo somewhere in the sea, that would be the price would be simply abnormal, because the transportation cost would rise. Yeah, finding any other port with different logistic could also be unacceptable, because the price of that logistic would be too high. And again, so force majeure does not release from the obligation. It just has some legal effect for liability, yeah, for non-performance of this obligation. But the obligation usually remains and should be performed later on. That is why force majeure, sometimes it could be used if the problem is quite temporary and could be resolved in some near future. But if there is no perspective, that is not a good solution, and some other solution should be looked for.
Okay, so Olena, I mean, what you just identified, I think, is again another fascinating area, and we could spend, the whole session. I recognize we're almost out of time. I do want to ask sort of one quick question for all of you, and give a quick 30-second response. What additional skills do you think that neutrals or ADR professionals should have when dealing with situations or claims, or try to provide guidance? What skills should they have, and should they either get training on that would equip them to actually provide assistance for disputes that will emerge and arise out of the current conflict? Tim, go first.
Oh, I thought I was going to get some time to think of what the answer was.
No, there we go.
Okay. Skills to assist it. Well, look, I have put I firmly put on the hat of facilitator and facilitation. And I have actually been studying what it is, and I've looked at what qualifications there are available to actually get the badge of facilitator. And there's a lot of stuff out there. It is a different skill from that of a mediator, no doubt. And I would say that having the skill, of course, you have some of the skills as a mediator, but you haven't honed them if you haven't done the learning and haven't read up on it and practiced it under the tuition of somebody who's already a skilled facilitator. So not sure that's quite the answer, but there we are.
Well, I mean, thank you very much. I'm always seeing another webinar series about that, so I'm sure that sure. Our colleagues are quickly writing that down now. Karolina.
So listening to what Olena was describing, I was thinking more about some mathematical, skill set that comes to the that arbitrators are able to quantify more what's at stake in the dispute. But when it comes to my experiences, I think that it's just about the conversational skills, the more human skills, because we may differ in our experiences, but ultimately the last thing that we can go down to that we share, and it's about sharing the experiences, is the human experience. So for me, it's more about the emotional aspect when it comes to, well, trying to resolve the dispute, and in arbitration more of the quantifiable mathematical kind of skill.
So in many ways, you're using, if you believe that sort of left brain, right brain type thing, you're using your sort of your kind of very much your risk kind of a measurement approach, but also having understanding about empathy and understanding about listening and demonstrating that. Olena.
I could only agree that negotiation skills is definitely a plus, and some psychology, which is actually connected with negotiation skills, I think, but it's more about medicine than about the law.
Excellent, yeah. And one thing that I'm just going to repeat, which is what I had in my last slide, is really listen. And you've all mentioned about listening. And it's sometimes really hard to listen, particularly if people are saying something that you don't agree with, or you're dealing with something that you have a very strong, opinion about, and learn from others, but also learn from yourself and your own response. Like, oh, that's interesting that I responded that way. And also the last thing to do is, and then what you can do is use that information to try and act, because what we want to try and do is not react, but we want to act, because it's about having practice, about having conversation, and about having the skills. Isabel.
Thank you, Ranse. Thank you also to Karolina, to Olena, and to Tim for really, really fascinating discussion and contributions. Thank you also to everybody who's been busy typing away in the chat. I'm sorry that we haven't been able to take more of those questions, but I hope that the discussion has actually covered a good number of the points that have been being raised there. I thought I'd leave you with one final thought from an extraordinary mediator by the name of Jackowicz Abdi, who unfortunately passed away in about 2017, 2018. And there's a book called Mediation and Governance in Fragile Contexts, Small Steps to Peace, which I can highly recommend to you. But one of the things that she mentions in that as a practitioner is the recommendation of the most difficult thing, which is realizing when you're not the right person to continue in the neutral role and you need to hand over to somebody else, and the humility to be able to do that. And I think given the discussions that we've been having around all the different neutral roles that there are, thinking very carefully about when one stops and another begins, and whether you remain in that role or you hand over to somebody else, is a really important responsibility of all those who take neutral roles, whether it's as arbitrator or as mediator, as facilitator, or as early neutral evaluator, or any of the others. And I thought I'd leave you with a quote, which I'm sure that most of you will recognize, but never ceases to make me ponder again, which is, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I hope that we'll get to see you all on the 15th of June for the next in the series of acute dispute and underlying conflict. And until then, please look after yourselves wherever you are in the world. And I hope that some of this has been useful in navigating acute disputes in the context of underlying conflict. Wishing you all the very best. Good morning, good evening, and good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.